Yeah, so infuriated is going to be the sequel. I'm working my way through the dictionary. So it was indivisible in 2012. It's infiltrated this year. I didn't realize that until the book was coming out. I thought, do y'all want to turn some lights on or something? I don't need anything, but the mic seems to be working though, right? Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, as Rick said, I think we've got maybe 50 or 100 books that the early registrants, you have a free copy. I would ask if you're one of those people and you like the book, take 2 minutes and write something on Amazon. It doesn't matter really what you say, 5 stars though, and just say something nice, right? And don't even do that. It's just that, as you know, many of you know, when you're kind of out making controversial arguments, there are people that I assume have government jobs, and so they're in nothing really to do, and so they just sit and do stuff on Wikipedia and write nasty reviews on Amazon, And so my plan, honestly, tonight, because I've kind of got sort of 2 intellectual trajectories. I think of them as sort of 2 tracks in my mind. One is the faith and science track, and the other is faith and economics. All of this, and people that know me know that I think of all these things as implicitly apologetic. Bill Dembski and I were at Princeton Seminary together. I was working on a PhD. He was working on an MDiv. While writing his second dissertation for a second PhD, right? So I'll get a master's at the same time. And we were so frustrated as students by the kind of uniformly left-wing and theologically liberal perspective that we thought students were getting. And we witnessed a guy that came from Moody Bible Institute, and he was ready to do business. He wanted, to sort of engage in theological battle. His first year, that was September. By May, he'd completely lost his faith, And so this made us so mad. We thought, well, what can we do? We should invite people to come speak. We thought, oh, actually, we don't have any money, so that's not going to work. So we said, we're just going to start an apologetics seminar right on campus and do it on Tuesday nights and make students that are concerned, just make them promise to sign up and speak. And so, honestly, that's how that started. That's how we started doing these things. And it wasn't, we didn't have any kind of master plan, but what happened is we sort of dropped into a situation in which there was a void that needed to be filled. And that's when I realized there's something to be said about certainly preparing yourself and certainly being prudential in what you say and what you do. But ultimately, you have to do something. A couple of weeks ago, was with a guy named John Schnatter, who is the founder and CEO of Papa John's Pizza. I don't know if you guys know anything about him. He's a conservative Christian, lives in Indiana. It's a $3 billion company with 4,400 stores around the world and still growing at like 12% a year. And so he started the company in 1985. And he's a typical entrepreneur, a doer rather than a talker, sort of the opposite of me in some ways, basically a talker. And so not necessarily the most articulate guy, but passionate. And the question that was in my mind is, okay, he starts this company in 1985 and he decides he's going to have a pizza chain. I mean, you think about that. That's like, gosh, maybe I'll start a computer company, right? I mean, it's kind of a competitive environment. So I thought he must have had he'd done some kind of analysis and had done an MBA to find out what the pizza market was like. And so I'm going to ask him, why pizza? You know what the answer was? When he was 15, he got a job at a pizza parlor and he got to make the pizzas in the back. And he loved it. And that's why he did it. That's the reason. Okay, so you see what happened is that he retroactively figured out how to do it because that was his passion, right? And that's my sense with the growth of Ratio Christi is that there's folks involved that have been trained and learned apologetics, but it's also a sort of a group of doers. Because that's what's going to finally have to happen. Because I think, unfortunately, because we've talked, if you were at the conference here for the last 2 days, we are all acutely aware of how hostile the culture is and how much more hostile the culture is now than it was just a couple of decades ago. I'm talking about in the United States. And so we can get ourselves sort of down about that. But I actually think that we are at a moment of unique opportunity, and that apologetics is also uniquely poised, I think, to be able to exploit that opportunity. So what I decided to do, I was going to talk about this sort of economics from a Christian perspective tonight. Woke up this morning and thought, a lot of you did some people hear me last night? Yeah, a good number of you. I thought, I don't want to kind of do the same thing twice. And so I totally changed my mind about 6 hours ago. So, so what I really want to do here is that Rick has left a good amount of time for questions. I guess we've kind of eaten it up by taking so long with the dessert. But I'd like to just sort of have conversation. But so what I wanted to do here for a few minutes tonight is a couple of things. First, I thought a few kind of suggestions and preliminary thoughts just from somebody that's kind of been doing this stuff. I've done debates. I've done debates on, intelligent design, on the existence of God. I've done debates on global warming. I've done debates on capitalism, and that's where I spend most of my time. And so, again, I didn't ever take a class on debate. But I sort of found myself in this situation. People ask. I remember the first time I was asked to do a debate. And there's a moment of kind of terror when you're asked to do that the first time. And I thought, well, the worst thing that can happen is I will learn what that's like. And I'm not going to ever know what it's like to do a debate if I don't do a debate. And so whenever I'm asked to do something that sort of pushes me past my comfort zone now, I think that automatically. Oh, that'd be an interesting thing to do. I was asked when I wrote Indivisible, this book, would you do the audiobook unabridged and just read it out loud? How hard can that be, right? Sure. Well, 55 hours later, right? It's 12 and a half hours. Every time I would touch my pants, they'd have to redo the thing. But, again, if I thought, gosh, that sounds like a lot of hard work, I wouldn't have known what it's like. And so a lot of you are active or budding apologists. And so for those of you that are budding apologists, I just encourage you, do all the preparing you can, but don't allow yourself to continue to sort of delay the moment in which you actually start doing this. Organizing events, but also doing apologetics yourself, right? The temptation is, like the bad Bible prophecy preacher that keeps putting down the date when Jesus is going to return, right? And so, then, that didn't work out, so we'll just move the date. And then he eventually figures out, move the date way out so you can't be falsified, right? That's the sort of temptation. And I've been involved in the intelligent design movement for years, and I know that this is the sort of dilemma that we discovered when we discovered that if you talk about intelligent design as a scientist before you have tenure, that's a good way not to get tenure. But we didn't quite realize that beforehand. And so now we have summer seminars at the Discovery Institute. We tell you, some of you here have been in the summer seminars. And the last day, we essentially say, okay, go back to graduate school and shut up and don't say anything about this until you get someplace strategic. But don't delay it forever, because I know people who said, okay, I'll wait until I get my degree to talk about design. Well, I'll wait until I get tenured to talk about design. Well, I'll wait until I get associate professor, right? Well, once I'm full professor. And then retirement, right? So that you can't delay it forever. And the way you're going to become a good apologist is actually to do it. You have to basically say, I told my daughter this, who was terrified when she was learning to ride a bike. And I finally thought, okay, there's no rules for how you teach a kid to ride a bike. But I said, hon, listen, you've got to decide if you want to ride a bike more than you don't want to fall on the sidewalk. Which one do you want? And you've got to want one or the other, but if you want to ride a bike more than falling, then that's what you're going to do. And you have to embrace the fact that you may fall and hurt yourself. She did it. I fell and sprained my wrist and hurt myself, right? So, sort of the divine justice, somehow, sort of dispensation. So let me give you a few preliminary thoughts just of some things that have occurred to me in the process of doing this. This is not sort of academic reflection, but practical reflection. Some of you may know I debated Christopher Hitchens back in 2008. It was actually a part of the pre-publicity for this Ben Stein documentary, Expelled. And I don't know how I got tapped to do this, to tell you the truth, but it was a movie company that was doing the promotion, called me and said, would you debate, we're going to do an event at Stanford University, and it's going to be broadcast to hundreds of churches live around North America, and would you come do it? We'll do the event, and Ben Stein and a guy named Michael Cromartie will moderate the thing. Okay, now again, at this point I was in the habit of saying yes to things like this, and so I said yes. But I was terrified about this because he's honestly, until he died, he was probably the most rhetorically gifted atheist alive. He's much more rhetorically gifted than the other new atheists, in my opinion. And so I called Bill Craig. And you know what he said? he said, oh, this is before Bill had debated him. He said, oh, you know, he's probably the most rhetorically gifted new atheist. I said, Bill, you're not helping here. This is, you're sort of worrying me. But you know, my problem, and the reason I was initially terrified, is that I was thinking, okay, how do I persuade Christopher Hitchens that there's a God? Right? And you see the mistake? It was a debate. You think I'm arguing. If you're arguing with someone, you presumably want to persuade them. I had just sort of imported that understanding to a public debate. And it was a fundamental misconception. And you can see why that's misconceived if you just put this in a legal context. Imagine that you're a prosecuting attorney, right? And you're trying to prove that a guy is guilty of, say, murder or something like that. And he's got Johnny Cochran or whoever the very best, defense attorney is. Now, what if you thought, man, I got to convince that defense attorney of my case? Right? You'd be depressed, right? You'd be taking medication probably. Your job, who is it? What's your target audience there? It's the jury, right? And maybe the judge. That's your target audience. And so you have to equip yourself and vindicate the case when you're arguing with this person, but the target audience is not that person, right? And so that's the opportunity that I think we have. We sort of worry about the fact that new atheism is becoming it's a powerful force in our culture. But at the same time, the truth of the matter is there are very few people in the United States that are still hardcore atheists, right? And as it turns out, hardcore atheism and materialism is about the worst philosophical position that you can take. There are a heck of a lot easier positions to defend, but these guys are out there. And so what that means is that we have the opportunity to argue with them, okay, and they have way overcommitted themselves on this, because, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, the things that materialism can't explain. Christians think about, we have to worry about the problem of evil. Okay, we have the problem of evil. They have the problem of everything else, all right? And we know that, and we need to understand that when we're dealing with them. So think of the new atheist not as your target audience, right? But they're your interlocutor, the person that you, of course, want to sort of vindicate the case you're trying to make. Doesn't mean you don't treat them as your enemy, of course. It's just that, God works on people. Sometimes people like Antony Flew change their minds. But for the most part, what we want to do is focus on who? Who would be the kind of, trying to think, who's the ideal target audience for a good argument? I would say the ideal target audience for a good argument is the rational but skeptical fence sitter. All right, it's an idealized person. There's not very many people actually probably like this, right? But the target, you don't think, okay, how can I deductively prove that the resurrection happened, right? As Aristotle said, you want the precision that you require for a subject to be appropriate to what the subject matter allows. I would like to be able to prove the Nicene Creed from the law of non-contradiction. I'd love to have an argument like that, right? But we don't have anything sort of like that. And you don't need that kind of argument. All you have to do is you have to, if you've made a good argument, it will be an argument that persuades somebody that's a fence sitter or that's open and questioning. And if we persuade just those people, what I will call our near allies, okay, people with whom we agree with some things and fundamentally disagree with others, we can completely turn things around. We can completely transform the culture. We don't have to persuade everyone. And so that's why the new atheists are an opportunity, because they're in many ways the perfect foil for us. And I wouldn't say this in a more public event, but they are the perfect foil for us. And I think that we could take advantage of that if we think of a particular rhetorical strategy when we're debating them, when we're discussing these issues, because I think there's a lot of really good apologetic strategies for a lot of different contexts, but the one that I found that is the most effective, at least for me in my own experience with those kind of rational fence sitters, is a discussion about the explanatory power of theism in contrast to materialism. Now, if you're a philosopher, you know materialism and theism aren't the only logically possible options, right? Those are, they're not jointly exhaustive of the possibilities. But those are the main competitors, right? When you have a game, you're not thinking, well, there's somebody else was here. You know, he'd be better than both these guys. You want to know who's sort of winning this debate. And that's the debate, and that's the debate that's more or less in everyone's mind. Is, you know, something like materialism or atheism true, or something like Christianity or theism true? And it turns out that if you just look at the things that people generally know and believe, virtually all of those things are much better explained by theism than materialism. To make that point, you got to do something. You've got to surface atheism and materialism, because there's kind of a rhetorical difficulty that some apologists get into in thinking that the burden of proof is on them to prove the existence of God, or to prove the doctrine of the Trinity or the resurrection or whatever, right? But think about this for a minute. Atheism, if you take the broad historical view, is a really weird, highly eccentric, very minority view in history. Very few people, you know, if you look at the sort of grand population of human history, most people have not been anything like what the new atheists are. And so we have to constantly remind people that, look, you can't simply make arguments against Christianity and theism. You've got to make a case for something else in particular. And so the question is always going to be, and it's like this, people do this every day, which of these things explains things better? Not which of these, you know, I can deductively prove, because nobody's in the position epistemically to do that, right? Everybody starts with a position of trust, right? Now, this is not a kind of presuppositionalist point. I'm not saying we can't make arguments to people with different presuppositions, but you got to start somewhere, right? And everybody's got to start somewhere with a position of trust. And so there are always going to be things that people already believe. Right? Now, I know, you know, that if you're in academic settings, you're acutely aware of the prevalence of relativism, which is just, I mean, relativism and materialism are, I think, as Alvin Plantinga said 20 years ago, the chief obstacles to gospel of the modern age. What's interesting, though, is that no one, I think, is actually a relativist. Right? The relativist philosophy professor can give a lecture making the case for the social construction of truth or something like that. He will be livid if he finds that his car's been stolen after class. And it won't just be, oh, this is inconvenient. He will be morally outraged. Now, why is that? It's because he already has access, some access to moral truths. Right? And we often forget that as Christians. We think, okay, well, I've got to make a biblical argument for why, you know, you need to believe in God in order to be moral. And there's something to that. But I think we need to step back and remember that your atheist friend knows it's wrong to torture children for the fun of it just as well as you do. This is not a surprise. And this honestly occurred to me not that long ago, and it was when I was preparing for the Hitchens debate. This is, again, it's before Bill Craig and some really good debaters had debated him. And so he had been debating pastors in different places that were not necessarily prepared to debate him. And I listened to all the debates that I could at the time. What I discovered is that virtually everyone up to that point, with the exception of Dinesh D'Souza, made this argument to Hitchens, that unless you believe in God, you can't be moral. Unless you believe in God, you know, you're not going to know that murder's wrong, right? Now, this is just a terrible argument, or at least it's a terrible argument for Christopher Hitchens. Why? Because Hitchens' whole case was a moral critique of Christianity and religion, right? So he's a moral realist, right? And so why not take that? Why not take, you know, the fact that he was actually pro-life, right? That's the actual position even of new atheists, is that they know just as well as you do certain moral truths. So the question isn't, well, can they know that it's wrong to murder and torture small children? Can they know that it's wrong to torment animals for no reason, right, unless they believe in God? No, this is God's world. Right? God has created a universe with particular logic and a particular structure, and part of that reality is a moral structure. And so just simply, as Paul says, by virtue of being human, right, the Gentiles do what the law requires, even though they don't have the law because it's written on their heart. So we don't kind of know this, but rhetorically for a long time, conservative Christians got in the habit of thinking that you can make public arguments, say, for the existence of God, but you couldn't make public arguments on moral grounds, forgetting that most of the arguments that are in the public square are moral arguments. Take the marriage debate. I just moved from Seattle to Northern Virginia. I was involved in the marriage battle before the previous election. And I knew we were going to lose. One, because a lot of money was coming in from out of state, but also because we had absolutely no idea how to argue. The most prominent pastor in this, I mean, there's a couple of nerdy philosophers like me, speaking to policymakers, which the pastor was the one on the sort of big radio programs, and his main argument, I'm not making this up, was God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. All right? And what's funny is we didn't actually lose by all that much. And so that was depressing to me because I kind of thought, well, there's no way we could win. I think we could have won, even in Washington State, if we had known what to say. Now, there are people like Ryan Anderson at Heritage and Robert George that have been making the right kind of public argument for the nature of marriage. But now, of course, we're playing catch-up culturally. And so what we want to do is we want to get out in front. And Ratio Christi is, of course, concerned with a defense of Christ, the person of Christ, the truths of Christianity. I would say sort of theism is it's like the philosophical distillation of the things that Christians and Jews and Muslims hold in common. And I actually think there's a lot of good to be done simply if you're a Christian apologist in making the case for theism. And the reason, I discovered this when we did The Privileged Planet, and I got an email from a guy that saw it at a university in Nigeria. Okay, I don't know how many of you have seen this documentary, but it's about the sort of fine-tuning of the universe and this particular type of fine-tuning I'll talk about in a minute. And he wrote me, and he said, I'm a physics major in Nigeria, and we just saw this documentary. I don't know how he got my email. I took my email off after the book came out because alien abductees kept contacting me. So got my email, and he said, I became a Christian as a result of this film. And I thought, what? It doesn't say anything about God. So what had happened? What had happened is that he was already almost there, but there was an impediment to belief in the truths of Christianity, and that impediment was the sort of plausibility structure of materialism. He saw an argument that didn't even make a case for theism. All it did is make a case against materialism and for purpose. And there was a sort of ground-clearing operation epistemically that happened for him, and he got the rest of the way there. Presumably he had heard the gospel at some point, right? And so you never quite know the things that you do, if you do them, the way in which they will contribute to that sort of breakthrough. So when I went to sort of debate Christopher Hitchens, this is what I actually decided to do. I decided to take 8 or 10 things. I had to pare it down because I'd been told I had 20 minutes, and then they said, no, you've got 13 minutes for your first argument. And he was back there drinking whiskey and Perrier, and seemed like he was ready to go. And I was like, okay, how do I make this case in 12 minutes, And then there's sort of a rebuttal. So what I decided to do is just kind of list things that everyone in the room, the San Francisco Atheist Club with the dinosaur t-shirts on, they're up in the corner over here. I guess they thought the existence of dinosaurs refuted Christianity or something, I don't know. But those guys, the Christian student groups, and it was amazing at Stanford because all the Christian groups worked together. So there was a Newman Center, which is Catholic, Campus Crusade, InterVarsity, and another couple of ministries. They pooled their resources to actually put this thing on and to sponsor it, that's a lesson. By the way, we have been in too many isolated, many Christian sub-silos. If there were just a unified Christian subculture, we'd be getting someplace else. But that's another tangent of mine. It's another talk. So what I decided to do is say, okay, all I'm going to do is I'm just going to say, Christopher Hitchens here, the debate is about the existence of God and whether there's evidence for God. He's an atheist. I'm a Christian and a theist. So what I want to do is I want to appeal to things that all of you in this room tonight already believe in, or at least things that you either know them or you think that they're true already. And what I want to persuade you of is that all of those things make much, much, much more sense in a theistic worldview than a materialistic worldview. I'm not going to give you a deductive proof. You might recognize this if you know philosophy of science. It's a way of confirming hypotheses in the historical sciences. This is actually what most people kind of do intuitively when you're trying to explain something, right? If you're a detective and you go into a murder scene or at least a crime scene, and there's a woman in the kitchen in her apartment. She's got a knife in her back. Her husband has just bought a $2 million life insurance policy and has fled the coop to Costa Rica or someplace, right? You're going to have to decide between multiple competing hypotheses, right? One would be that, well, this was just chance, or one that maybe a knife, was just flung randomly and it went through the window. Or maybe the multiverse proposition that, well, in some places there'll be a quantum fluctuation and a knife will appear in the back of a woman, right? That would be the multiverse. Or maybe the husband did it. That's the intelligent design explanation, all right? You see what's happening? Now, he's not reading Peter Lipton and confirmation theory, but he's doing this. And this is how we explain things all the time. We don't look for deductive proofs of things. Most things, you just can't, virtually nothing of what we would believe, and believe reasonably and with good grounds, we would believe if we had needed deductive proof for it. So just remember that. That's already how people are reasoning. And so I realized, okay, I can do that. I can list these things, and then I can hope that they will go home, those reasonable fence sitters, and think through these things and think, okay, let's see. Does this work in theism, or does it work in materialism? Does it work in one or the other? And I started, because the expectation was that I was going to make the case from science, because, of course, expelled and intelligent design and all that stuff. So I started with moral truths. I said, all of us in this room know that there are moral truths. Christopher Hitchens knows that. His recent book, Against Religion, was a specifically moral case against religion. When we're having the marriage debate right now, it's a moral debate between, is marriage a pre-political reality that a just and limited state ought to recognize, right? Or is it just a social construction, and so something like human equality and fairness ought to prevail, right? In Washington State, the bumper sticker was, I do support marriage equality. They framed it in a moral sort of framework and a moral context, and they framed it in a way that appeals to all Americans, because all Americans believe in fairness and equality, right? They knew to do that. We were saying God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. They won, and they won for good reason, because they appealed and their arguments resonated with people's moral intuitions. And so what we do is we dignify people's moral intuitions. Don't assume that they really believe relativism, right? Even if they've been taught it, just ask them to introspect. That when they reflect on this, my favorite example is torturing small children for the fun of it. All right? Think about it for a minute. Now, do you know or suspect that that's wrong? In fact, I would maintain that virtually everyone, unless their faculties are just completely miswired, knows that, and they know it more certainly and with more any truth of science or history. Any truth of science is going to be, sort of at several removes from their epistemic access, right? But moral truths are things that once we reflect on them, they're in many ways kind of like mathematical truths. Once you see that it's wrong, you just see that it's wrong. And so what we need to do is be cultivating that intuition. And then once people feel that acutely, say, okay, so you already know some moral truths. Even if you're an atheist. The question is, in what view of reality do moral truths make more sense? Now, if you're a theist and you believe that the fundamental reality is a personal and benevolent and good and all-knowing God who has existed from eternity, that's fundamental reality, right? And so he makes moral judgments. He creates a world that reflects those things. There's a location for that, right? Moral judgments make perfect sense. Everybody knows that. That's what this is why Thomas Nagel didn't like theism, right? He didn't want the divine foot in the door. He understood that if there's a God, God would care who he slept with, and he didn't want to have to worry about that. It was just that simple, right? And so people already know this reality. Think about materialism. What is a moral truth? If materialism says the cosmos is all that is or ever was or ever will be, fundamental reality are blind and impersonal processes, particles, matter, space, time, and energy. Fundamental reality is impersonal. It's non-intelligent, right? It's not clear in any sense how moral truths even fit into that, right? So notice I haven't proved that certain things are wrong and certain things are right. I simply said you already know that certain things are wrong. The only question is are you going to reject that and trump it based on some philosophical presumption, or are you going to say, okay, I want to start with the things I know most certainly and work my way out to a view of reality that is consistent with it and explains those things that I already know. Because that's the materialist presumption. The materialist presumption is to use a highly refined and arcane philosophical speculation about the nature of reality, and then use it to trump the very things that the materialist himself knows is true. That's a fundamentally anti-rational way of proceeding, right? You don't want something that you kind of know speculatively and vaguely, right, to override things that you know directly. And so that's why I think pounding home the universality of the conviction that there are moral truths is really important. We don't want to make the argument that if you're an atheist, you can't know that right from wrong, right? Now notice how that's a different kind of argument. Something sort of related to this, and I actually skipped this in the debate, was our knowledge of abstract truths, propositions, logical principles. Think about the nature of logical principles, like modus ponens. If A, then B, A, therefore B. What's going on there, right? Or 2 + 2 = 6, right? Now you can kind of confirm that empirically, but if you know it, what you're doing is you're seeing that there are these necessary relationships between propositions and truths. When Richard Dawkins is making an argument for Darwinism, he's assuming that you have the ability to do that, to say, oh, that's evidence for something, and that actually conduces to the truth of that proposition, and that argument will strengthen this proposition. He assumes you have access to abstract truths of logic and reason and things like propositions. Again, they already know these things exist. Their arguments presuppose them. The question is, where does it best fit? What best explains it? Where is it most at home? Theism or atheism? Clearly, theism. The reason I think that we live at one of the best times for what we're doing is not just that we have, I think, a good foil to make these debates, but also because the book of nature has been speaking against materialism for over a century. Remember, it was at the end of the 19th century, there was actually a physicist that predicted that pretty much all the things that had been discovered would be discovered, and it was just kind of a dusting up operation, and people should probably do other things than physics from then on. This was right before the quantum revolution and special relativity, right? So this was the moment in, say, 1900, when there were very few empirical reasons to think the universe had a beginning. Right? Now, there were actually some. The fact that the night sky is dark is actually evidence of this. But there was nothing that was sort of compelling to people. Well, it wasn't creationists that discovered that the universe had a beginning, that the universe is expanding in every direction away from us. In fact, it was the atheists that recognized immediately the implications of that idea. And here's the implication, is again, if you're comparing these two competing hypotheses, right? Whether you're a materialist or a theist, you have a metaphysical commitment that says something is the fundamental reality, right? If you're a materialist, it's the cosmos. That's why Carl Sagan in the 1970s could still say, or still said, even though he really shouldn't have, the cosmos is all that is or ever was or ever will be. Why is that? It's because what happens for all of us, if we're sort of thinking through these things, is that there's what I would call metaphysical pressure, right, to confer upon the thing you think is fundamental, eternality and necessary existence, right? And why is that? Well, because if you don't say that, if there's not some fundamental reality that's always existed and that explains itself, then you've got things popping into existence uncaused out of nothing. And that is the ultimate sign of desperation for someone to take that position, right? Well, this is the amazing time in which we live, right? Based upon that metaphysical pressure, it's the worst time to be a materialist. It's the first time we've known with a fair degree of certainty that the material universe is not eternal. We spend a lot of time arguing about its age. As Christians, we forget it has an age, right? It started, right? Whatever the number is, if it had a beginning, it's now a crummy candidate for ultimate explanation. It's so bad that people like Stephen Hawking can now say, right? First, that philosophy is dead, first page of his recent book. And then he said, this is a direct quote, because there is something such as the law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Now remember, this is not creation ex nihilo, because God's already there, right? This is a universe which doesn't exist, bringing itself into existence uncaused out of nothing. Now, if it doesn't exist, how can it have causal properties? And how can it have causal properties to bring universes into existence? This is the ultimate desperation. And so the fact that Stephen Hawking would actually publish a book and that a publisher would publish it, saying something like this, I'm convinced this is exactly what Thomas Nagel now is saying in his recent book, Mind and Cosmos. That 25 years from now, we'll look back and we will be shocked that anybody believed this. Because it's sort of the worst possible position to hold. And so that should be encouraging to us. We want constantly to make this point. Not to persuade Stephen Hawking, but for people to see what the options are. Besides, of course, the beginning, I don't need to spend a lot of time talking to you guys about the Kalam cosmological argument. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about fine-tuning. But some of the arguments for fine-tuning are so compelling that there have been scientists that have actually become theists as a result of this. Arno Penzias, who was the co-discoverer of the background radiation, is Jewish, but not really a believer. Because of fine-tuning and a cosmic beginning, he became a practicing Jew and a theist again. So this stuff has persuasive power. And what's important to realize is that these aren't arguments that sort of apologists are developing, right? This is nature pushing back, right? It's like the Empire Strikes Back. It's the universe striking back against the materialist worldview, and it's getting there before we do. And this is exactly what we ought to expect as Christians. Because remember, God reveals himself in two books. I said this briefly last night. And that doesn't mean the Old Testament and the New Testament. Right? The Old Testament and New Testament, that's God's special revelation of himself, right? In which he reveals his acts in history. He gives us his name. Things that you're not ever going to learn from, doing deep space astronomy or something like that. You're not going to know that God's name is Yahweh, by sort of studying a globular cluster. It's just not going to work, right? But as Paul says in Romans, from the foundation of the world, God's invisible qualities and eternal power have been clearly seen from the things that have been made. The book of nature does reveal a creator. It does, like a book, point beyond itself. Think about the nature of a book, because books are actually passive, right? I mean, unless you've got one of the voice-activated Kindles, you have to know how to read the book. It's not going to read itself to you, right? But what happens when you read a book? When you're in the first grade, when you're learning how to read, what are you doing? You're looking at the shapes of the letters and the orientation of the words, and you're trying to sort of phonetically put it together. You're not reading. You're just decoding, right? It's like your gaze stops at the opacity of the page in front of you. When you learn to read, what happens with the mind is that you read through the text to the meaning of its author, right? That's what you do when you read. If nature is a book, it's a book that the Bible says actually actively participates in these things. So in many ways, far more than a book with an obvious author, it points beyond itself. And that's something that we should come to the discussion with confidence. It's just great that these are the Big Bang cosmology and a cosmic beginning and fine-tuning. These are things discovered despite the community that made the discovering thinking that they couldn't be the case. Of course, Steve Meyer's work in The Origin of Life and Signature in the Cell is, I think, one of the more powerful arguments for the informational reality of biology. The argument had been floating around for a long time, but Steve, I think, has made it very powerfully and very rigorously in Signature in the Cell. And the structure of his argument, incidentally, is this multiple competing hypotheses. Because materialism, again, matter, space, time, and energy, right? When they're talking about information, that's like the enemy's tool, right? That's not something that, would sort of be intuitively obvious for the materialist. So to discover that information, even sort of in the sequence specificity of the DNA molecule, which is what the Signature in the Cell talked about, to discover that you can't explain what's going on there without appeal to this third entity information is a profound discovery. And to realize that you can't suppress the reality of information, which is what a lot of folks tried to do. Because we know something about information, and we know that information in our universal experience is uniquely given to us by intelligent agents. It's the exclusive jurisdiction of intelligence. I mean, we call it information. And so this is, again, something that was not all that well understood. And this is actually a convergence of information theory and discoveries in biology and sort of philosophical rigor, so that we now have a convergence of both evidence and ways of making the case that I think, obviously, again, atheism or materialism and theism, an informational world, an informational biological world at its origin, it makes a heck of a lot more sense in theism. The book that Guillermo Gonzalez and I wrote was a kind of a new argument. We tried to find precursors and saw it in Kepler and a couple of other people. But our argument was not just that the universe is fine-tuned for the existence of complex life. It was that there's a specific pattern that you can discover by looking at all the things that are needed for life, not just at the cosmic level, but at the local level. So you get a fine-tuned universe in which the laws and constants and initial conditions are very precisely fine-tuned for the existence of chemical life. Turns out still most places, even in a fine-tuned universe, are not going to be compatible with life. You're going to need it to happen in a planetary environment. It's going to need to be around the right kind of stable star, the right distance from the host star, so that you have the liquid solvent that's needed, water. Why do you need water? Well, if you're going to build molecules in organisms, you've got to have some kind of substance or element that's metastable. And what that means is that it's possible for it to build up larger structures. It's possible to code information in these things. So it's unstable in that sense, right? It can be changed, but it's stable enough that these things can be transmitted. Turns out that water and carbon are uniquely fit in this particular universe. One example, the carbon chemistry is most reactive over the same narrow range of temperatures over which water is liquid. Right? Now, why does that matter? Well, it matters because the range of temperatures in the universe is vast. And the vast majority of places in the universe are not in that range between 0 and 100 degrees Celsius. Well, the privileged planet, I won't give you the whole argument tonight, but we go through all the factors, the fundamental factors that are conducive to habitability in a planetary environment. And we say, okay, that has to kind of get put together really well. And a lot of people thought we were going to stop at that point and say, doesn't that look like design, right? You got to get a planet that's the right size, right atmosphere, right star, right distance from its host star, right sort of chemical elements and all these things. It's like the watch, right, that you find resting on a heath. The problem is the universe is a big place, and so there's a lot of opportunities for chance events to happen. And so our feeling was that, well, just that alone, it might be that somebody could say, okay, maybe I buy fine-tuning, but we've got a universe with some 10 to the 22 stars in it, in the visible universe. Maybe that, it could happen once or twice just by chance. That seemed reasonable. But the purpose of the book was not that. The purpose of the book was to show that the same rare conditions that make intelligent life possible in a planetary environment also provide the best overall conditions for making scientific discovery. All right, so if you want a habitable planet in a planetary system, you're going to want it to be in a large spiral galaxy, very much like the Milky Way. For various reasons, you're going to want it to be about midway out from the center to the edge of the galaxy between spiral arms. Too close to the center, hostile to life. Too far out, there's nothing but sort of hydrogen and helium. So there's a very specific galactic habitable zone where you'd want a planet to be if it was going to host life. Now, let's say you could pick one place in a galaxy where you wanted to be, if you wanted to be able to figure out the structure of the galaxy you're in, see distant galaxies, detect the cosmic background radiation, separate the cosmic background radiation from local sources of radiation, view different kinds of stars, all the things astronomers and cosmologists want to do. Where would you want to put that planet? In the galactic habitable zone. So you see there's this pattern, this very eerie pattern. It looks like a setup to discover that those rare places where observers are also are in the best place overall for observing, right? Again, if theism is true and the universe is designed not only for life but for discovery, that makes sense. It answers it, doesn't? But if you're a materialist, this is not something you would expect. In fact, Guillermo and I are convinced the reason we got to discover this argument and this evidence, because a lot of it was based upon new data, but none of the people that knew the data had thought of it. And the reason is because they didn't even consider it a possibility. Again, this is something that makes perfect sense in a theistic context, but not in a materialistic context. I'll give you just a couple of other examples of this, because I want to take some time for questions. Of this sort of comparison of competing hypotheses. One that I'm going to do is a promissory note for the most powerful argument that we are going to have had is just around the corner. If you heard Tom Woodward at the conference yesterday, he's talked about this. He has a book on the so-called epigenome. There's a colleague at Discovery Institute or at the Biologic Institute in Seattle has been working on a manuscript now for about 7 years called The Immaterial Genome. And it is going to transform our understanding of biological reality. Now, I can't sort of explain the argument to you in detail here, but I'll give you a hint of it. Okay? Think about the weird paradox that you've got an organism, right? Let's say you've got a single-celled human embryo, right? And it has a DNA in its nucleus, right? Something weird happens because you've got this initially kind of undifferentiated cell that suddenly starts differentiating, and somehow all these different cells with the same DNA in them, some know the head goes over there, others know the tail goes over here, others know the heart goes here, so these need to be heart cells, these need to be brain cells, these need to be same DNA in them. Where'd that information for spatial coordinates come from? Right? It's staring us right in the face. There was something weird happening. Well, right? And what Sternberg has done is I'm privy to this because I've gotten to read various permutations of the manuscript. He's developed essentially a kind of Gödel theorem type of argument for biology. Gödel showed that for any system of sufficient complexity, there's going to be propositions in that, think of a language system or a logical system, that are true, but they can't be proved within the system. They need propositions from outside the system, meta questions, all right? Sternberg is doing that with life. That big book, The Signature in the Cell by Steve Meyer, he was focused on the most basic kind of biological information, one-dimensional information in the DNA molecule, right? So you got sequence specificity. But that doesn't do anything unless it's at the three-dimensional informational capacity. DNA doesn't become anything, right? It doesn't produce unto itself. So we've always kind of had to know intuitively there's got to be more to it. What Sternberg shows is that at every informational level, there's got to be a level above it to explain what can't be explained at that level. And you get to this level, there's got to be a level above it to explain what's happening at this level. Now, this is an empirical argument based on very rigorous reasoning, right? And the implication of this is that organisms in time, from so your initial conception to death, what we see is sort of slices of time. An organism is something that's continually accessing information from outside itself. It has to be accessing information that's essentially immaterial. Right now, I know you're thinking, this is the weirdest thing. Where did I come tonight? What's he talking about? But I want to tell you this so that 5 years from now, when you've got this argument, because it's going to be those of us in this room that are going to translate this argument for ordinary people. I told Rick Sternberg, this manuscript, the reason it's gone on so long is that he's got 2 PhDs, and I said, Rick, it needs to be written so that people with just 1 PhD can understand it. Right? He uses this thing called category theory, and it's a step above set theory. And I was with John Lennox a couple of years ago, and we're talking about it. And this is John Lennox, right, professor of mathematics at Oxford. He said, oh, category theory, it's so abstract and difficult. And I thought, okay, we got to kind of get the hay down on the ground where the cows can eat it, right? And so, but this is going to be a very, very powerful argument against materialism and for theism, because this argument, if you work it out, you get something far more than design. You actually have to resuscitate the classical understanding of causality, material, efficient, formal, and final causality, actually to explain what we know empirically is happening in biology. And so it's a very exciting time to be alive. This is not an argument you can necessarily make now, and so it's a promissory note, but it's out there. And it's something that's going to be deeply, deeply disturbing to the materialist elites. Well, let me end there, but with one final example, because I spend a lot of my time talking about economic freedom. And I live in the DC area, and there's a weird kind of person in DC, and they all collect in the DC area. And they're called anarcho-libertarians. And right, I don't know if you heard this term, but what it is that this is people that believe passionately that humans have freedom, that we should exercise our free will, that it's wrong when the state suppresses that. They believe that humans have intrinsic dignity and equality, that we have rights that the state must respect and can't define or redefine. Right? They believe in freedom and reason. And they're also atheists. All right? Now, my view is they're right for the picking. They are near allies. Because all of those things, you call those the libertarian intuitions, right? Freedom, what is freedom? Ayn Rand said, she's an atheist, she said, every man is an end in himself and not a means to the ends of others. That's the natural law speaking, folks, right? How does she know that? She knows it, but she has no basis for that in the materialistic worldview. All of those near allies that are deeply committed to freedom, they need to be taught and slowly educated by their friends that encounter them that if you want freedom, if you want agents, right, that actually have the power to move, physical reality, an agent that can actually cause something in the physical universe to move, that is not at home in a materialistic framework. Materialists have to be, if they're consistent, committed, finally, to denying that they exist and that you exist. And my humble opinion is that if an argument that you're listening to entails that you don't exist, that you shouldn't believe it, right? And that you have the best possible reason for not believing it. In many ways, the world is our oyster. We've got the case for all these things and the way of explaining much more satisfactorily all these things that our fellow citizens actually already believe are true and obtain. We just have to connect the dots for them. And I pray for all of us in this room and for all of those that we touch that we will all be prepared to make a defense for the hope that is in us. Thank you very much. Do you want to?
Go ahead and, if the audience has questions, if you can speak loudly rather than me running around with the microphone. We're short on microphones here. So, yes, sir.
So I want to ask a question about clarification about this promissory. From what we know about developmental biology, it is all self-contained.
Right. Right.
Information that's in the embryo stored in there that's delivered to it by the mother.
Right. There is. Right. There's some. Yeah, that's right.
There's no information that has to appeal to a higher information. It's all there. So
no, that's a presumption. That's precisely the point of this argument.
Right. So the point of the argument is that where does the origin of the information?
It's not just the origin of, no, it's not just that. That's where the mind wants to go, is that I'm saying there is an immaterial source to information at the moment of conception. But it turns out if you work this out, just think about it intuitively, right? You start with a single undifferentiated single cell, right? It has the DNA in it, right? It's just that, physically it's that thing. Okay, and yet it knows how to differentiate itself. It has spatial coordinates and these kinds of things. There's a presumption that it's all in the organism. In fact, Darwinism assumes it was all in the DNA until recently.
But the spatial information comes from the fully differentiated organism, which is the mother, inside which the egg develops.
No, but the problem is if you look at sort of the sources of information, let's take the DNA. Okay, you're sort of assuming that, right? But the only sort of informational source that anybody was talking about until fairly recently was DNA, right? Neo-Darwinism actually requires this. It requires, look, you need a source of innovation and perturbation. You find it in genetic mutations. This is, this is the selfish gene. This is Richard Dawkins' sort of view. Now, a lot of biologists know that this is not true now, right? And so what's happening is there's a search for the other sources of this information. And so that's where the term epigenomic came from. The implication of Sternberg's argument, though, is it's not just that, the DNA does a lot of stuff and then there's a couple of other things, right? But that, in fact, what we're looking at and what we've been analyzing so far informationally is like the tip of the tip of the tip of the tail of the dragon. Now, like I said, I can't without, it's honestly a very complicated argument, so I knew I was in trouble, sort of throwing it out there, but you do get you got the implication is that, yes, of course the mother provides information. Of course there's something that's transmitted. The question is whether what happens in development can be explained entirely from that initial event. JT?
Yes, Jay. So Sternberg's argument is going to reintroduce things like formal and
yes.
Causes. To take the best advantage of it, you would want to be within a tradition that's sort of Aristotelian.
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Like St. Thomas?
Yes, yes, thank you. Yeah, we talked about this beforehand. No, we didn't. Absolutely. This is the thing. If you're an SES student, you actually know this. But guess what? The average church Folks don't know this. They don't have any idea what you're talking about when you talk about exemplar causation, informal and final causation. We do this, I'm in charge of doing this to the Discovery Institute summer seminar students. It's like SEAL training because, you know, it all sounds very abstract, but it has a huge explanatory power. And so I honestly think that Sternberg's arguments and some arguments like it, what they represent is a reintroduction of these traditional causal categories, Aristotelian Thomistic causal categories, but on a sort of firmer empirical basis so that we actually see the explanatory power they have. Because that was at least the stereotype, right, of Descartes and Bacon, was that final and formal causation were not fruitful. You know, it's like you say, well, what is it about this drug that causes people to fall asleep when they take it? Well, it has a dormitive property, right? Well, that's not a very satisfying explanation. You just sort of rephrase. This is the kind of dilemma. Now I think we're going to have a way of accounting for things, accounting for things that we see empirically, but not being able to account for them without appealing, as Sternberg does in the manuscript, to what he calls paradigmatic and exemplar causation, essentially formal causation. And so there's going to be a convergence of traditional philosophical categories and new empirical discoveries. So if you're at SES, you're in the right place.
We got time for one more question. We got some student testimonies I really want you guys to hear. So one more.
Nobody else will ask. Simple. I think it's simple. And there's two parts. But the materialism, theism
Yes.
debate.
Comparison, yeah.
Is that written up so that I can read it and learn it?
You know, you would think I would have written it up, wouldn't you?
Well, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know. You can watch it in 7 parts on YouTube with the Hitchens debate, and I probably should write this up at some point, but I got distracted with the economics, and so.
Which was brilliant.
But honestly, I mean, in many ways, what I'm doing is I'm just simply reframing a lot of arguments that a lot of you already know, right? It's just that what I want us to see is that there's a cumulative case to be made, right? When you do this multiple competing hypotheses thing, in which you simply look at the scope and the explanatory power of these two different ways of viewing the world. I don't buy the Thomas Kuhn argument that, you know, paradigms are incommensurable. It's just hard to compare them. It's not impossible. And it's quite clear in these cases, I think, where the kind of metaphysical pressures of materialism would go and where the metaphysical pressures of theism would go. And so really I'm just suggesting that we take up all these arguments that other folks have been developing and frame them in this way. So thanks so much. Thanks, Rick. All right.